All right, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this brief reprisal of the ERISAfire virtual town halls. For those of you who were not aware or are new to our little merry band of misfits, in 2020, we had a series of town halls related to COVID-19. Those are available, by the way, on the ERISAfire help site, help.erisafire.com, under the section COVID-19. We had these like on a weekly basis, bringing in various experts to talk about things as they were changing, because they were changing very rapidly. We expected, as did most people, that the pandemic would be, broadly speaking, short-lived. That turned out not to be a reality. Instead, here we are back with, at least here in Houston, Texas, some mask mandates in schools and all kinds of places. And so it continues. And along with the pandemic has continued legislation and regulations, and all kinds of new things have been happening in 2021. For those of us in the industry who wear the badge of ERISA Geek proudly, things have not slowed down, and it's been a challenge, but we're here to meet it. This morning's virtual town hall is going to focus on one particular issue, and that is mental health parity. I am your host, David LeFevre. I'm an ERISA attorney of about 15 years or so, focusing almost exclusively on employee benefits matters. As I look at my bio here that I'm supposed to read, I authored 2 treatises that are published in Bloomberg Law, and I got to tell you, those were a whole lot of fun to write. One of them was on tax law, and I almost put myself to sleep writing it. But it is incredibly important, as you all might know, when it comes to employee benefits. But like I said, we're here to talk about mental health parity, and we're going to jump into it here pretty darn quick. As I introduce the subject matter, a couple of things about the format of this virtual town hall. We encourage you to ask questions. There's a Q&A chat box for Zoom. After a couple of years of doing this now, most folks are pretty familiar with it. So enter your questions as you have them into the chat box. And then one of my colleagues who's helping us produce this was going to let me know that we've got some questions. We're going to pause every so often to take a few of those questions. And Kendra, if you don't mind popping in with the audio to let us know what those questions are, but we'll kind of answer them periodically throughout the presentation. But first, let's just kind of set the stage a little bit. The reason we're talking about this now is because the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, or CAA 21, which was a COVID relief piece of legislation, but like many things in Washington, it was a junk drawer for a lot of things, and had a bunch of things tacked onto it. One of the things tacked onto it was a step up in standards and enforcement for mental health parity. Recall that mental health parity, the MHPAEA, or Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, was actually passed in 2008. So it's been around quite a long time. However, enforcement was difficult. DOL and HHS are pretty understaffed. And the carriers have been really, really resistant to complying fully and completely with the law that was passed in 2008. So Congress had to step in and say, we need to do something. Remember, if you will, the High Tech Act from 2007, I'm getting a little geeky here for folks, that was a HIPAA related thing. HIPAA was passed in 96, similar thing happened. Not a lot of compliance, especially from health plans. And so in 2007, HIPAA was modernized a little bit and new enforcement standards were added, and Congress admonished HHS to audit plans. And that's why you had a resurgence of HIPAA awareness happening from like 2010 to the present. Same kind of thing here. Congress saw that the Department of Labor was not enforcing it with as much gusto as it wanted. No knock on the DOL folks. They were trying very, very hard. And we're going to get to some of that here in just a minute. But the carriers had been really, really resistant. In addition, to strengthen the enforcement of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, Congress added some requirements in the CAA 21 that are applicable, as we're going to find out now. That's why we're talking about it now. From my own experience, having dealt with mental health parities on self-insured health plans, the compliance with the law has been reluctant from the carriers to say that nicely. Case in point, I was working on one of the Blues self-insured plans last week and the week before. And I'm not gonna say which Blue, but I was working on one of their Blues, and it was only like a month ago that this particular Blue was telling self-insured clients that it was not in compliance with the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. Now, of course, it didn't say we are not in compliance. Instead, the communication to the employer, and you may have gotten one of these. It looks like this. It says, hey, your plan as it's currently designed may not be in compliance. We might recommend a change to your plan. If you read between the lines, what it says is the benefit program application that you filled out that was designed by us, the carrier, was not compliant to begin with. And we're going to tell you about it now. This is only happening now here in 2021. And the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act was passed in 2008. So that just gives you an idea of like how it is that we got here and why it's becoming such an important issue. At this point, I want to introduce our guest because she knows a whole heck of a lot about this. Jessica Waltman is the Vice President of Compliance from MZQ Consulting. And she is a health reform and business strategy consultant with more than 20 years of experience in health insurance markets, health policy, and executive leadership, mental health parity being something she is very, very well versed in. One of the primary reasons we wanted her to speak to you all today is because Jessica was proverbially there when it happened. She was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for 16 years and was around when the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act was passed in 2007 and 2008, when it was being crafted and passed. She has worked with insurance commissioners on a wide range of issues, including mental health parity, and she's represented the National Association of Health Underwriters, NAHU, in coalitions of employers and health insurers, advocating on behalf of agencies and employers on issues like mental health parity. And so we want to give a warm welcome to Jessica. Thank you for being on our little program here today.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me.
So one of the things that I've gathered from speaking with you and reading the things that you've written, very well done, by the way, is that the risk is real. Like this is really happening right now. And if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what it is that you're seeing, because you deal with this mental health parity compliance stuff on a daily basis. So what is it that you're seeing? Why is it that this is resurfacing as such an important issue right now?
Right. Well, thanks for referencing my past in Washington and working on this issue, which I have had a longstanding interest and involvement with, both in lobbying and enforcement over many years. And as you noted, it wasn't very well enforced, particularly at the self-funded employer plan level. Some state insurance commissioners did a better job than others in making sure fully insured plans were compliant. But a few years ago, I left my lobbying career and became the vice president of compliance at MZQ Consulting, which is a small compliance consulting firm. We specialize in a lot of areas, but when the CAA 21 passed this past December, we waded through. It's actually just fun fact, the longest law ever passed by Congress to date. It's almost 6,000 pages long. We kind of parsed through it. We found the provision requiring all employers who sponsor group health plans, both fully insured coverage, level funded coverage, self-funded coverage, grandfathered plan coverage, grandmothered plan coverage, whatever you've got, it requires you. And if there is a health insurance carrier involved that offers you fully insured coverage, if you're self-funded, you're on your own. It also gets at the fully insured carriers, and it says, you guys, we have been required to comply since 2008. You didn't really get with the program. We set two kind of stipulations on how you had to comply. Many of you did get with the program relative to quantitative treatment limitations, which are things that you can count. So for example, many years ago, you might have had a separate deductible for mental health care services, or it might have cost you $100 copay to go see a psychologist and a $25 copay to go see your pediatrician. And that's not the case anymore. But what plans do many times when employers don't even know that it's going on, they imply kind of squishy limitations called non-quantitative treatment limitations, or NQTLs, on the plan. Every plan has them. And they make it more difficult sometimes for people to get mental health care. So just as an example, most plans impose a prior authorization requirement for different kinds of services. Maybe your plan applies it to all inpatient hospitalizations, regardless of what they're for. Or what's more common is you require it for all inpatient mental health visits. And then for medical visits, it's more like if you're getting a transplant or you're having a knee replacement, then you have to get it. And it just outlines specific benefits. And it's not
So it's
equal.
really the kind of stuff
Yeah.
that's behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's behind the scenes. So it's not equal.
And I'll speak from some of my experience. A lot of times our firm will get roped in on disputes with out-of-network providers. And that's where a lot of the dirt of a self-insured TPA or carrier acting as a TPA gets revealed, is in these out-of-network provider disputes. And so, I've dealt with a couple where, the plaintiff's attorney or the out-of-network provider was asking for all kinds of other documentation that was, why was this claim processed the way it was? Because the SPD or the booklet just says the carrier pays what it says it's going to pay, right? It's very abstract in what it is that the actual plan document language says. And instead, there's this like internal document that the carrier as TPA is using to adjudicate these claims. And so what you're saying is that there's all these internal processes and documents that are being applied that employers don't even really know about unless they have a complaint from an employee or something like that.
Right. Like, so there's a lot of stuff. I mean, some of it you might be able to find if you know where to look, and some of it an employer never is going to know. And, you've hired your third party administrator to do that, or the PBM to do that, or your utilization management vendor, whoever, to do that for you. And that's what you've paid for. They're doing that behind the scenes. And then there may be cases where it's discriminatory and you don't even know. Well,
Gotcha.
So what the law said was, guess what, employers? Well, you don't know. You've also kind of not been paying attention for the last 13 years. And so what we're going to do is require you all to do a comprehensive analysis of your plan to find all of these squishy things that hide in the background and find out what they are, how they're being applied, if they're being applied fairly. It's very detailed how you have to do it. And you need to be able to produce it for us now. It was actually due on February 10th. The law says any employer of any size that offers any kind of health plan should be able to pull this out of their files and email it to a DOL auditor at any time.
So let's back up there for just one second, because a lot in employee benefits, generally speaking, and we do a fair amount of retirement work and health and welfare, but with respect to both, usually Congress will pass a law, and the deadline for its applicability is the first plan year beginning on or after some date that's usually about a year in the future. And then it shows up on the DOL's audit priority list, and then it gets disseminated to the regional offices and disseminated to the individual EBSA agents, and then they pick it up and then they do something about it. And maybe 2 or 3 years after the law is passed, there's actually some noise about it. You said February. Right. So CAA 21, and folks, this is important. CAA 21 was passed in December of 2020. It was a funding bill and included a whole lot of other things. And in the legislation, it said that the compliance date, the date by which you needed to have this report, was only 2 months later.
Right, 45 days from when the law passed.
Right.
And the reason why
expectation by Congress, right? Unreasonable expectation by Congress. So being a realist, I'm thinking, there's no way that an agency can actually move on that, but they have.
Right, because what they've said is, you say it's an unreasonable expectation. And if you're an employer that's like, I don't have that, it's the first time I heard about this thing, don't worry, you are in good company with like 99% 95% of all other employer group plans out there. But the Congress's point of view, shared by the Department of Labor, is this has been the law since 2008. You didn't have 45 days, you had 13 years and 45 days. And you should be able to get this together. And yes, 45 days isn't a long time, but you should have been doing this all along. So, kind of like if you've been in school for 13 years and then the teacher's like, okay, you have 45 days to write a term paper. You can't be like, I didn't do any assignments or any reading, and I didn't learn how to do math. And I was just sitting here in elementary school and middle school and high school for all these years, and I didn't do anything. I can't do a paper in 45 days. No, that's ridiculous. So it's kind of like that. They think that you should be able to whip this out. No one has done it. But using that time frame, then they've said, you know what? When you said, oh, it usually takes a couple of years for the DOL to get their act together. No, they've been preparing for 13 years. And actually, if you kind of look back and you're nerdy about this, they've been taking steps since the very end of the Obama administration. There was some provisions in the 20th Century Cures Act, which was that law that passed. It was one of the last big laws that President Obama signed into law. And you might remember it as the cancer moonshot bill,
Right.
kind of championed by now President Biden, right? And it included some guess what, guys, we're not enforcing this very well. We should start taking some steps. And since this is a bipartisan effort, if you're mad about this law, get mad at everybody, because this isn't one of the COVID bills that was under dispute and passed through budget reconciliation. This is one of the ones that basically everybody voted for. So the Trump administration took steps over the past 4 years to kind of get the Department of Labor ready for this. So now the Biden administration is here. They've inherited this law that goes back to something they were already focused on the last time they were there. And they're like, we are making this our number one priority. And they have started sending out audit letters already to, hundreds of employers are currently under audit, and they've also been collecting all their complaints that they've had. And I know, because I'm helping people with audits right now, occasionally it's random and they're just kind of doing a fishing expedition, but most of the time they know what's in your plan. They know what was in your plan document last year. They know how your third-party administrator processed these claims for the last 5 years, and they are digging back in. And they are after you now because they want to not only get your plan into compliance, but they want all of these vendors that serve our industry, these carriers, these PBMs, plan document providers, all of the people to get it together so that all or substantially more group health plans offer, and individual plans are subject to this too, but health coverage offered in the United States, it meets this compliance standard, both on the really obvious stuff up front about, you can't charge, an additional deductible for substance use disorders, but also that squishy stuff on the back end that makes it harder for people to access coverage when they need it. Yeah. And they are actively auditing.
Yeah. And so I've got here up on the screen one of the charts that you'd prepared that segments the types of enforcement violations that DOL has found between government fiscal year 2010 to 2015. And, folks, we can do the math, right? That's 6 years ago that the last of this segment, this time period, or since the end of that time period. So this has been quite a while. And, on the right-hand side of that chart, nearly 60% of the violations DOL has found between 2010 and 2015 were non-quantitative treatment limitation issues with mental health parity compliance. And I remember so it was pre-pandemic, so it had to have been about 2 years ago in October, I was in Dallas talking to some of the EBSA folks there, and every single one of them was talking about mental health parity and how frustrating it was seeing the lack of compliance from, in particular, the carriers as TPAs. And I have my own theories about why it is that the carriers have resisted. I've observed some of the effects of this resistance myself. The renewal presentations from United Behavioral Health, UHC's mental health wing, And I've heard their folks making presentations, and I have observed a fairly strong resistance to true, legit, straight up technical compliance with mental health parity requirements. And there are varying reasons for it that they give, but financial is usually one of them. And if you think about it, most of the major carriers are all for-profit institutions. And Blue Cross will occasionally act like a for-profit, even though it's a nonprofit. And part of me thinks that the carriers have just had a hard time figuring out what to do. Like, it's got a program for how to control costs on the med-surg side of things. And part of their resistance, I believe, is that they just don't have a firm grasp on how to control costs. Aside from doing things they're not supposed to do. And before the call, or before the meeting here, you and I were talking about one of those ways, which was to drive those reimbursement rates so low that it causes mental health providers to leave the network. And so you wind up having this like entirely really skinny network for the mental health providers and a much, much larger med-surg network. Is that a non-quantitative treatment limitation?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and hey, like, this is one that probably all of us, if you've had someone, either yourself or someone in your family that needs mental health care, or, just even colloquially, how many therapists do you know that take insurance?
Yeah,
So like,
itty bitty.
right? Like, they don't. And, a lot of them are sole proprietors. They kind of, some of them may have been burned. Like, they may think they might not get, they may think they don't want to do the paperwork, but also they can make more money elsewhere and doing it privately and putting it on you. And then when you can't find somebody that takes your insurance, then it can disincent care. I mean, I will give you a real life example. I had a child that I thought might need inpatient care at one point, and I contacted his doctor and said, what do we do? And he said, there aren't inpatient beds at this, like, in this part of your very regional metropolitan area, your very metropolitan area. I mean, I live in a suburb of a top 10 city in the United States, very big, where there are, Ivy League medical institutions, world-class children's hospitals. And he said, unless your child is suicidal, they don't have beds because they can't get reimbursed. So there aren't places for him to go. Now, can you imagine, like, as a mother, I mean, like that, like my husband and I mean, that was a really big problem for us, but it was also a big disincentive. My son couldn't get the care that he needed, not because there weren't doctors, not because we were close to world-class medical facilities, because those institutions hadn't made beds for kids because they couldn't get paid for it. I mean, that is a really extreme example, but that's the type of thing that we're dealing with. And while you're like, oh my gosh, and we're going to get into why this is a big deal and why it's hard for employers to do, and I will explain why they're coming at the employers. I mean, basically legally, that's their way in, their back door. But the other thing is cleaning this up out of your plan and other plans. It will stop this practice moving forward. And so while it's a lot of work on our end, there's cost involved, it's tricky. It also can do good, and it can benefit not just, everyone on this call probably has group coverage. So, and yes, we're looking at what do we need to do to make our group coverage compliant, but also there is a do good component to this. The whole idea behind it is really to make sure that people who need it have access to the care they need and get rid of these obstacles that, most employers that pay for the bulk of the coverage don't even know that are there. Certainly the people that need the coverage don't know that it's there. They just can't get it easily. So that's the point of this. And the reason why the Department of Labor is hitting up particularly self-funded employer plans is that the law, ERISA, gives them regulatory authority over them. And the Department of Labor's idea is we can try and get employers one by one, but what is probably more effective is on the self-funded level. We know that everyone uses the kind of same grouping of third-party administrators and other vendors. So you referenced United, obviously they have a TPA that is one of, the biggest in the country, if not the biggest. And they have their subsidiary United Behavioral Health that again serves millions and millions of Americans. If they can find problems with specific employer plans that have those two entities, or insert whatever vendor name you want there, anyone with a problem, if they can get at their employer plans, expose the plans, and then pressure those companies to fix them, they will fix the problem not only for your employer plan, but for every other employer and employee and child of an employee and spouse of an employee that has that coverage nationwide. And so they can do what they call global correction. And that is what they're doing, and they're coming at it hard. I can tell you right now, I have 3 audits in process on my desk, and they all they're through different TPAs, different employers, different states, and they are all based on the same problem because these people have a vendor in common and the plan provision is the same. And the Department of Labor is auditing them all. And I bet by the time they're done with just those 3 that I'm involved with, that vendor is going to fix it because they don't want all of their clients to be audited. And so that's why we have to do these reports.
Gotcha. All right.
Also, I think you just said on the side, besides that good thing, I think on your slide too, there's another incentive. And that's because even though the employers didn't know this was going on, there is risk to them and liability to them. So I think on your slide there too, you've got the points that there are fines involved. If you're out of compliance, the Department of Labor is trying to get you and your vendors back on the right track. But if you don't do it, there are fines up to $100 a day per affected beneficiary. That is heads up. You can.
And I wanted to ask you about that. So I know like the ACA and ERISA kind of in general has this provision that there are fines for 100, 110. It's indexed depending on which section you're referencing for various issues of non-compliance. So let's confirm. Was the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act made a part of ERISA such that ERISA applies and its penalties apply? Yes. Gotcha. Okay.
Yes. And then there's also penalties because if you're a plan that's not subject to ERISA, which is probably not a lot of your people in this call, but there are some, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act actually has a broad swath, and it also applies to state level plans, church plans. It applies to CHIP. I mean, it predates the ACA. It applies to grandfather plans. So it has actually a very broad scope. And so
that'd
there
be
are also plans.
PHSA.
Yes. So there can be penalties for non-compliance there too. So even groups that you might have that you might think, oh, they don't have to worry about this, they're not subject to ERISA, they are. But there's penalties involved for the employer and employer liability in a self-funded plan. They're the only ones with financial liability. They can also be sued. As you noted, I think right in the beginning of this, you talked about, a case that you were involved with and the plaintiff's attorney. And so all of this information, not only can the Department of Labor say, give us our stuff, where's your report? We want it in 10 days. And that's what they're giving people, 10 days to get it together. Because they're like, what? You should be able to give us faster than that. You should be able to just whip it right off of your, shared network drive. It should just be right there. They have that, but a plaintiff's attorney, plan participants, any of your plan participants could come to you today, just like they can ask for your plan document. They can ask you for where's your NQTL analysis. They've had enforcement of that with plan participants for the last 6 years. There's actually a form on the Department of Labor's website to help the plan participant, to guide them through what to ask. And if you get it, you have to turn it back over to them within 30 days. So this has all been going on, and and now they're starting to do it. The Department of Labor is starting to ask, and if a plan is found to be in non-compliance, it will not be long before the wronged mother contacts an attorney and gets them involved as well.
Indeed, indeed. So let me dovetail just a little bit on that. So I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit. Let's say my business is making stuff, right? I make trucks. I pull oil out of the ground. I make medical devices. This is what I do for a business. Maybe not the medical device company, but I pull out oil out of the ground, right? That's what I do. I pull natural gas. I move natural gas, whatever the case may be. I could probably just run the risk on a DOL audit. There's not a ton of agents, and maybe lightning won't strike on me. All right, there's one aspect. But then a more salient risk might be the plaintiff's attorney risk. And as we talked about, this was kind of copied and pasted into ERISA. And so you're going to have the attorney's fees shifting provision of ERISA that says if the plaintiff wins, they get attorney's fees potentially. Like, that's a big deal. That changes the settlement dynamics tremendously. But then there's this issue of disclosure. Like, if I create this document, and now I'm playing devil's advocate here, if I create this document, it's now subject to disclosure. If I don't have it, I don't have to disclose it.
Well, you do have to disclose it. There is a requirement even before this one that you had to turn it over within 30 days to any plan participant. That's actually how they started the enforcement going back to 2015, 2016. They were trying to get plan participants to ask for it first. So
no kidding.
If you get a request from the Department of Labor, they're going to give you 10 days. You might be able to get another 10 to 2 week extension. If your plan participant asks you for it, you have 30 days with no recourse. And it's not an easy thing to get together.
Right.
So
what you're saying, just to clarify,
your obligation for disclosure exists regardless.
Okay. And that's so I want to make sure we're clear with folks on that there is no, if it doesn't exist, you don't have to disclose it. It's similar to the request for documents under ERISA for plan documents.
Right. It's just a question, are you scrambling to get it together?
Yep.
Right.
If they ask and you don't have it, you have to produce it and you have to create it and then turn it over. There is no I only have to turn it over if it exists. That's not true. Right. If it is requested, it has to not only be produced, and you could do, you might be able to run the risk on a formal ERISA plan document or wrap doc and create one real quick and then send it, right? It's technically possible, not advisable, but it's possible. But you can't do that with this analysis, right?
Right. So this might be a good time because we've been talking in kind of theoreticals. And I know if I was listening to this call, I might be like, what are they talking about? Like, what do I need to make and how hard could it possibly be?
Yes,
and how long does it have to be? So maybe it would be helpful for me to explain, what is this thing?
Please.
Okay. So you have to take your plan and identify any non-quantitative treatment limitations that your plan applies. And the Department of Labor has given some examples, and there's some obvious examples. So I would say the types of things that you might do, the employer doesn't do any of these things, but part of your plan would be you might impose things aren't covered unless they're medically necessary. And your plan says what is medically necessary. It makes up those standards. So you're excluding things, you're not covering things, you're limiting coverage based on what, this arbitrary definition of medical necessity. You might require prior authorization or pre-certification to access specific benefits. Sometimes when most plans have an aspect of what they call utilization management. So on the back end, someone at the TPA, or they often outsource this to another firm, a nurse, a medical advisory board are looking at the care. And that's the type of thing, if you go to, remember if anybody has a child and they're older, they used to be people only need to stay in the hospital for 24 hours after giving birth. And they were pushing people out. And then Congress passed a law and they made it a little bit longer that you have to stay in the hospital. But there's a formula. You have a baby and you have a natural delivery and you get to stay in the hospital X number of days. And if you have a C-section, you should be out in 4 days or whatever it is. There are standards in the industry and there are people on the back end of the plan that enforce that. And they're talking to the hospital and saying, you want to keep this lady in the hospital for longer, you have to explain why she's doing that. And that's called concurrent review while you're in the hospital, or afterwards. If they didn't do prior authorization when they were supposed to, or something like that, they might post-claim review, or like, look at retrospectively look at your claims. They might require that you have a treatment plan to access certain services. You might be followed by a care manager, and you go home from, you have a disease like diabetes. You might be assigned someone from your health plan to follow your care and make sure that you take your meds, things like that. There's all kinds of limitations on prescription drugs. What kind of drugs are on the formulary? Does the plan cover, 37 drugs to treat epilepsy, but they only cover, 2 drugs to treat ADHD? Do they cover the brand name drugs and make it easier to get the brand name drugs for epilepsy? But for ADHD, you have to have the generic, even though, you might say, oh, for my child, they're allergic to the binder and they need the brand name drug, or whatever. Is that hard for you for certain medications? There's, what happens when you go out of town? Can you if you had a medical emergency while you were in France, you might get some medical coverage for, you broke your arm. What if you have a panic attack in France? Do you have any type of mental health benefits when you're overseas? Possibly no. I mean, you might just be like, hey, the bounds of the United States is it. We don't cover you. You go to France, you're on your own. But sometimes there's differentiation. So you have to go through, are there different kinds of hospitals? Do you say that a regular hospital is defined as this, and it covers most hospitals, but to be a substance use disorder facility covered by the plan, you have to meet all these excessive criteria. So you have to go through your plan and identify all these NQTLs. Typically, a plan applies between 20 and 30 kind of standard ones. And then there's, sometimes differentiation between them. So to identify them all, you have to define them. So say, what does prior authorization mean to my plan? Write that all out. Then you have to identify what benefits does it apply to. And there's categories of benefits under the mental health law that you have to follow along with. And you have to say, okay, for inpatient care, in network, prior authorization is required for, this and that, and all the things, list them all out. Then you have to say, what triggers prior authorization? Like, why do we decide that hip replacements need prior authorization? Is it the cost? Is it that it might not be medically necessary? Is it, what are the factors? What triggers the need for prior authorization? And then how did we come up with those factors? And just saying, well, Blue Cross made them up when we hired them, that's not good enough. So you have to figure out, like, where did Blue Cross come up with this? You have to ask them, you have to get the information out of them. And then you have to say, okay, so cost is one of the factors. What's their threshold? Is it more than $1,000? Is it, where do they get these things? What's the evidence? Like, what do they use to say this is a high cost procedure? How do they carry that out? How do they enforce it? You have to get all that out in writing. So you have to look through your documents and find these secret documents that the plan might have on the back end. Your TPA might have a manual for providers. Blue Cross may have internal policies that they're using to administer a plan. You have to seek these out, which is a process. Then you have to look at your plan and say, okay, this is what they say in writing. And maybe they say, we require prior authorization of all mental health care, inpatient and outpatient. And you're like, okay, and that's what it says in our plan document. You write that down. But then you think to yourself, well, wait a second. I go to the psychologist, every 2 weeks, but I've never had to call and do prior auth. Well, do we really do that? So then you find out, oh, you know what? They only require it if you're in an intensive outpatient program where you're going like every day to, treat a very serious disorder. Like, they don't really require it on everything.
Which is not what they're doing on Med-Surg.
Right. But like, how do you prove that? And just being like, well, I didn't have to call anybody when I went to, made a therapist appointment. I just found someone in the network. That was the hardest part. I didn't have to get prior approval. I just made an appointment and I showed up. That's all I had to do. No, you can't just say that. You have to prove it. So you have to get some de-identified claims data and show, well, we didn't require, go back to them and say, Who did you require prior authorization of? You have to test the plan and provide documentation operationally to make your point. You have to ask them questions, document their response, get them to give you information. You know, how many cases were subject to prior authorization on the medical side last year? How many on the mental health side? You know, how long did it take you? Does it take, 5 minutes to get prior authorization for a hip replacement, but 3 days for them to get back to you? If you need to go into a 28-day facility for chemical dependency, that's a problem. So you have to kind of get a handle on all that data. And then for each NQTL, you have to write a conclusion and say, how did we do on this? And then you have to take, and again, there's probably going to be somewhere between 20 to 30 major NQTLs applied by your plan that you didn't even know. And then at the end, you have to assess all of them and say, okay, so we did 25 and 20 of them, we did it great. Our plan says if you go outside the bounds of the United States, you're not covered. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you're getting, stitches or you are, having a nervous breakdown. It's just, we don't cover you outside the bounds of the United States. End of story. We're fine on that one. We don't apply it differently. But if you apply an NQTL just to mental health benefits or just to substance use disorders, that's a problem. Or if you apply it unequally, like you apply it to more services or you pay them less or it's unequal, then that's a problem. And you have to outline all of your problems, and then you have to show how you're going to fix it and write this reason conclusion. You can't just give them a document dump. You can't just give them paper, and you have to have this report at the ready if the Department of Labor comes for you or a plan participant says, I couldn't get a therapist that was in our network, or there's a complaint with the Department of Labor. And like I said, it's their whole focus. If you use a carrier as your third party administrator that they're upset with and they suspect of a problem and they've targeted, 100 of their clients to get it audited and you got picked, you've got to have this at the ready. So generally these reports run between 100 and 150 pages long. And as you can probably gather, it's a lot of work to get all this information and get your vendors to give it to you.
So let's pause there for just a second.
Yeah.
And because I know we've got quite a few questions from employers here. But just to kind of recap a little bit of what you're talking about, kind of conceptually, it's not just a matter of plan design, but it is these other documents that are in the background about how claims get processed and a kind of a claims level. Are we doing this? Are we applying the same rule differently to mental health claims and addiction claims in the aggregate than we are medical surgical? So there is a claims level of detail that is needed. So it's kind of one part plan design review, but also a claim audit of sorts. As you mentioned, that is a lot of work. So let's pause here for just a few minutes and have Kendra announce some of the questions that we've gotten from folks along the way.
So our first question is, could you confirm if this is for both fully insured coverage as well as self-funded?
It is. If you have fully insured coverage, your carrier shares liability. And if you have a fully insured plan, what I would do is after you get off this call your broker or call your carrier rep and say, where's my report? What are you doing for me? And they're going to send you something, or like they might say, we don't have it yet, we're working on it. They may send you something. I can almost guarantee you it is going to be incomplete because I've seen a lot of them for major carriers around the country. And what they've done is they've probably identified their NQTLs. If it's a fully insured plan, and then you have they may be, you're working with a PBM, but they may not have the information for the PBM. They might just give it for the medical benefits, not the prescription benefits. You have to do it for both. But they'll give you if you're lucky, you'll get a document that kind of says, these are what our NQTLs are. And this is how the factors we use. This is the evidence we use, and kind of a chart. It will not have any information specific to your plan. It will not have any of your aggregate claims data. It will be a generic thing that everybody in your area that has that plan could get. It is what I would take it. I would file it. I would say this is best I can. If you are audited, they're getting audited too. It's more likely that the Department of Insurance is going to come after them, because when they file their plan next year, the commissioner is going to be like, hey, where's your stuff for every plan option that you offer? Some carriers are doing this for every plan option they offer, and they're using the aggregate data, but a lot are not. I mean, regional carriers are more likely to. The bigger ones, I haven't seen them do it yet, but maybe they will. So that's kind of the thing. So, but the thing is, if you get in trouble, you both get in trouble. Like, the liability is equal. And they will need them to fix it, and you have a little bit more claim to get it. If it is self-funded, you have to do it. And while you need your vendors to help you, they have no legal, they'll eventually get hunted down by the DOL too. But as for the first thing, for if you don't have the document to show, they're not getting $100 a day fine. You are.
Right. So kind of just conceptually, if you're sharing liability with the carrier, you might have some plaintiff's attorney risk, the DOL risk. They're really, as you mentioned, this is global compliance. They're looking really at the carriers because they want to change the world for as many people as possible. On the self-insured side, though, if you think of a hierarchy, the plan sponsor is where the buck stops. The TPA, the carrier as TPA, is a vendor to the plan. It is beneath you in the liability chain. So the employer is the one directly responsible for this. One of our other questions came in and says that the employer remarked that this is a lot of work. Like, is it even possible? And that's a real question, right? So I'm thinking of going to one of the smaller blues that just couple of weeks ago said, oh, we got a problem with our ABA exclusion, which is a non-quantitative treatment limitation, because you're eliminating a treatment option for a condition, which is not similarly applied to med-surg, right? So it's coming back only a couple of weeks ago. And we're saying, as a self-insured plan sponsor, hey, I need whatever I need to do this report. I need all these secret documents. I need to know how you're applying the squishy standards to my plan, because it's not an aggregate. Right? Maybe on the fully insured side, they get to do it on a book of business basis, but on the self-insured side, you can't do it on an aggregate basis. It is that individual plan. Oh, and by the way, we do have some carriers acting as TPAs who are saying, I'll give you an aggregate report. I'm not going to give you an individual report, right? Will that pass muster for a self-insured plan?
Was that your question? So I think that if you were audited, no, I mean, I would take it as a start. If they're going to give it to you, okay, but that's your data. You're self-funded and it's your data. And so, and really, how they act in other plans, that doesn't mean that your plan, your employees were treated that way. If they give you their aggregate book, it does not mean that that's what your plan's experience was, and that's what they're looking at. So it's a start, but it will not be deemed complete. So again, I take it, but it's kind of like, let's put it this way. If you were at school and you got that, it'd be like a solid C. But if your parents looked at your report card and they would be like, no, we expect much better of you, Dave. You're very smart. We expect, B+, we expect A's in this house. It's not an A, it's not a B. They will make you fix it. They will ground you. They will penalize you until you start getting A's. You're gonna have to make that better. Do you take, if that's what your TPA gives you, and that's the best you can get, okay, that might be a risk a business would be willing to accept, but know that it's not going to pass muster if anybody really digs into it, and you're going to need more. And the other thing is, that's your data, your plan. They are supposed to give you claims data. You have a operational reason to have this data. The law has given you a clear health plan operational reason. Also, you don't need PHI here. You don't need individual claims to look at. You need your own plan's aggregate data about, how many prior auth requested we turned down for mental health visits last year versus medical surgical? What was the percentage? You know, how many claims were out of network for mental health care versus medical surgical care? I mean, there could be a vast difference there, right? And why? That type of stuff, it's important for you to know for your plan participants.
Yeah. So kind of just talking process wise, like what's it look like to kick this off, to get this started? Let's say that an employer does look at its population and its risk tolerance and the risk tolerance of their investors and say, okay, like mental health is not only organizationally important, but it is also important from the employees. So not just top down, but bottom up as well. And this could very well be an issue. Or we've even had people complain about the processing of mental health claims and how difficult it is. And so the organization decides, okay, we need to do something about this. From what I'm hearing from you, just going to the TPA, and this has been our experience as well, by the way, recently going to the TPAs and asking for non-quantitative treatment limitation analysis. It is a lot of work. It's a ton of work. And asking the TPAs, what we get back is not going to cut it. Either it's aggregate, like the good carriers acting as TPAs for self-insured plans are providing an aggregate book of business analysis that's halfway decent. And you could probably get by, at least buy some time with DOL, or it may even work for a plaintiff's attorney who doesn't know this law inside and out. So you could probably buy some time with that. But a lot of the carriers are just saying no. Like,
yeah, I mean,
like, no,
yeah,
we're not going to do this. We have no plans to, there's a nice way to say it. But they're basically saying, we'll get around to this eventually. And the carrier as TPA is not acting as a TPA. It's kind of treating the employer like the carrier's in charge, and it has all the information. So it does make it difficult. But let's say that we do want to dive in.
what do you do?
Yeah. So
like, okay, so I'd say like there's a couple things that you could do. So one of your questions is this a DIY project or not? So everyone has different interests. The Department of Labor has a self-audit tool available on the website. It is free. It has directions. It leads you through how to do this. It's, you know, like you can just Google DOL mental health parity self-audit tool and it will pop up. And it's probably like 30 or 40 pages long. You can, I mean, like, and if you're really like, I think these people are lying, or I really still can't get a mental picture of what you're talking about, I would also encourage you to Google that because it kind of gives you an idea. It doesn't give you a sample, but it does give you questions to ask, things to look for, kind of like a process to follow. Depends on your interest. I fully acknowledge, mostly because my family tells me every day that I am very, very odd. And I find this interesting and fascinating and like to dig through this stuff. So if I owned, you know, if I were also someone that could pull oil from the ground or, you know, make anything that anybody would want to buy to scale. I make really good homemade tomato sauce, but I don't know how to can it and like distribute it on the masses. So like if I could come up with something that I could sell, I might also like to do this myself, just like I like to make tomato sauce and do this. But if not, and you decide that this is something that you want to have, and this is your risk tolerance level, or you know they've come after you, someone's asked for it, then you can also outsource it, which is of course, you know, the reason why ERISAfire has brought you and me here. Like we do have an option for you to help you, and that you can get a vendor, ERISA partner, Fire partnering with MZQ to do this for you. And we will work with you to go after these vendors and make them give us the stuff and then prepare the report and do the analysis for you. And because we've done this a few times and we're kind of, you know, onto their tricks, we know which ones are difficult, we know which ones are not. And, you know, you have to, the employer, of course, has to provide the way in, right? They have to say, oh, okay, this is our person that's doing our analysis. And, you're allowed to give our de-identified claims data to them, and they're doing the report, and these are the questions that they're going to ask you, and here's where you put the stuff. There's going to need to be make a connection on your part, but then we work with ERISAfire, and we get the stuff, and then you can hire out a report. And there are other vendors in the marketplace, not very many. And again, you can also try and get what you can from your carrier. And as I said, if I had fully insured coverage, I would start with that. I would take what they get. I'm selling against myself. I would not hire someone like me right now. If I was audited, sure. But if I wasn't, I would take what they have. And then if the Department of Labor or a plaintiff's attorney comes, then you can move forward. If your TPA is great and they give you something and it's aggregate data, you might want to take that solid C+ and sit on it. Some TPAs, like independent TPAs especially, are finding vendors for their employer groups and hooking them up or helping. Some vendors out there are proactively doing this. I mean, there's some really great PBMs that have said, we're going to do this. There's some really great utilization management firms, but they're the exception rather than the rule. So you might be able to cobble that together. But if you don't want to do it, you can also throw money at this problem and get someone else to do it for you.
Yeah. So I'm going to pause here just real quick and have a couple of questions here. Kendra, and then I'm going to leave maybe 1 or 2 minutes at the end here after we answer a couple of these questions to kind of describe what it is that we're doing to help folks. If you've done this internal risk analysis of the C+ is just not going to cut it for us. So I'll talk about that here at the end. But Kendra, I know we have a couple more questions here.
So this is for the DIY set. Is it better for the broker to request some of these reports for self-funded employers plan, or should the employer ask?
I have my opinion. Jessica, what do you think?
Well, I mean, some brokers are really involved with this and are willing to provide a degree of support and are willing to help you. This is a big job. And if you can get the broker to help, fantastic. There are brokers that are not going to want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Maybe an indicator to you on other levels, but a lot of brokers are trying to make sure that their clients are taken care of and recognizing that this is, the employer's pulling oil from the ground and that this is the broker's job. So if your broker will help you, great. And the broker may have insight, much like, Dave and I do, of where to go and how, they have had multiple clients with the same vendor. So they may have a good idea of who to email, what to say. But bottom line, no matter who you get to do this, whether you're doing it DIY, whether you're paying someone, however, the employer is always going to have to be authorizing this and being involved, at least on a cursory level.
So just in general, I think I've encountered resistance on the mental health parity stuff for years and years now, because it also is just personally important to me. And so if an employer is like, hey, I want you to look for mental health parity compliance, I'm like, no problem. But I've always encountered resistance. And the most progress I've been able to make is working directly with the employer as its counsel to send that letter, because when it comes from the employer, you can a lot of times get a little bit better response than if it's coming from the broker, just because it's the broker's job to threaten to move business, right? That's how you get them to give you additional stuff or decrease rates. But when the employer says, no, I'm very, very serious, you need to do this, it speaks volumes. So I would say, in general, it helps to come from the employer.
It's always going to, I think it actually has to come from the employer. Like the broker might be able to help you and say, email it to this person or send it to that person. Like this is who's doing it there. That type of stuff. Yeah, if the broker has insight, take it. But it's always going to need to come from the employer, because the employer is the plan fiduciary. The employer is the one that's responsible. The employer is the one that has the authority to get this information from their plan that they paid for. The buck stops with them. They have to give authorization. I mean, yes, you have an agreement with your broker to act on your behalf, but you still have to say, we want them to have this for us. So when I say work with the broker, sure, if they're willing to point you in the right direction, take it. But ultimately, the employer is the one that's going to have to ask for the information for their own plan.
Yeah. So we're here at the top of the hour. It's 11 o'clock and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So just wanted to make that announcement that it is 11 o'clock. If you need to jump off and head to another meeting, please feel free. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes here to talk about what our process is for helping folks address this. Once you've done the internal kind of risk assessment that the C+ is not going to cut it. So we, both the law firm, LeFevre Law PC and ERISAfire, are working with MZQ to get this done. As you can tell, Jessica has a lot of expertise and loves actually working on the nuts and bolts of pulling these out, the claims needed, the policies and procedures from the carriers that are needed to do these analyses. And her firm has, this ain't their first rodeo. A number of audits they've got already. So when it comes to working with, for instance, United Behavioral Health or one of the national carriers, they've got the knowledge, the process knowledge of how to get through the traps that the carriers as TPAs are laying down. And so we're working together to get the information that we need. MZQ will be working on the analysis. Our firm is working with the employers to help gather information. There's a big questionnaire that's required. We've gotten to know your plans very, very well. And so what we're trying to do is to facilitate this process, because as you could tell from the presentation, these analyses are very detailed. They take a lot of work and it requires a lot of detailed input from the employer or its plan. And so we're helping to facilitate that communication of information and getting to MZQ what it needs to do the analysis. The reports come back to us so that we can have, as counsel to the employer, using or bringing in the insurance agent to the maximum extent possible. Some states allow for insurance agents to be part of attorney-client privilege, some don't. But as much as possible to have a privileged conversation about the results so that at the end of the day, when you do have an analysis, you can decide whether to bring it up from a C+ to a B, from a B to a B+, or a B+ to an A. We can have all those privileged conversations about what needs to change, where's the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest change to make that'll affect the greatest number of people, kind of the utilitarian approach. And that's an individualized risk assessment with each individual employer. And we can have those conversations with you so that at the end of the day, when you have the report that has to be given to DOL or plaintiff's attorneys or anybody who asks, it is something that the organization is comfortable with. You're not going to be blindsided. And we do put our law firm's legal opinion on it. And if there are questions from the Department of Labor, we will aid in the defense of the Department of Labor audit. So that's kind of how it works. And if you're interested, let us know. But otherwise, I want to thank everybody for their time. And we look forward to speaking with each one of you. If you have additional questions, feel free. We're going to leave the chat open for just a little bit. Go ahead and pop your additional questions into the chat, and we will try to get back to you individually with those. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for everybody listening to this super important, but also sometimes super boring and nerdy topic. So
acknowledged.
I appreciate you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.